The deeper we look into the past, the harder it becomes to find solid proof of our history before a certain point, say, before the 18th century. At some moment, the official timeline begins to crumble, leaving more questions than answers. And one of the most visible and disturbing questions isn't in dusty archives, but right beneath our feet, in the heart of our oldest cities. All over the world, from Europe to America, from Siberia to Australia, we see the same strange phenomenon. Majestic buildings, supposedly from the 19th century, with windows and doors that go straight into the ground. Entire floors, masterfully built with high ceilings and fine details, are buried below the level of modern sidewalks. We are told this is the result of a cultural layer building up over time. It's an explanation that sounds logical at first, but it falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. Think about it. How fast would this layer have to accumulate to swallow 10 or even 13 feet of a building in just 1 or 200 years? And why would the architects of that time design magnificent doors that lead into a solid wall of earth, and windows meant to bring light only to basements? These are not just architectural quirks or miscalculations. This is a systematic, worldwide phenomenon indicating that the soil didn't build up gradually. It came from above, all at once, covering cities in a thick layer of mud, sand, and clay. The buildings didn't sink, they were buried. This is not a cultural layer, it's a layer of catastrophe. What if what we're seeing isn't the slow passage of time, but the silent evidence of a global event that was intentionally erased from our collective memory? What if these phantom floors, now turned into basements, are the undeniable proof of a massive cataclysm that happened not in the distant past, but relatively recently? These aren't just sunken buildings, they are clues. Clues that suggest the official version of our recent past may be a grand deception. This mystery, frozen in the stone and brick of our cities, is just the tip of the iceberg, just the first layer of the secret. To understand what buried our cities, we must first dare to ask another question. What were these cities? And what was the world like before it was buried under a wave of mud? What if beneath our feet lie not just buried floors, but the ruins of an entire world that was far more advanced and unified than we can possibly imagine? To understand the force that could bury entire cities, we must first see what it buried. The answer to what lies hidden beneath the layer of mud is far more astonishing than the mystery of the buried floors itself. That answer is etched in stone. When we lift our gaze from the buried windows and look at the buildings themselves, an incredible picture emerges. A single, harmonious architectural thread runs across the entire planet, connecting continents and cultures that, according to the official story, developed in complete isolation from one another. From the opera houses of Chicago and Buenos Aires to the government buildings of Calcutta and Melbourne, from the banks of St. Petersburg to the train stations in the Siberian hinterland, we see the same recognizable signature. Majestic columns, intricate porticos, perfect symmetry, and domes reaching for the sky. We are told this was a trend: neoclassical, Renaissance, Baroque, styles that were supposedly copied all over the world. But this explanation only raises new, more uncomfortable questions. How could young nations, which had only just appeared on the map, construct such architectural masterpieces? Where did the pioneers of the American West, who lived in log cabins, suddenly get the knowledge, resources, and technology to build marble capitals that rivaled Roman temples? How did cities that looked like they were transplanted from Imperial Europe spring up overnight in colonial Australia, at the edge of the world? The official history asks us to believe that all of this was built with horses, primitive pulley systems, and manual labor in record time, based on blueprints that were somehow instantly distributed worldwide without modern communication. This version isn't just questionable, it's absurd. The scale, quality, and ubiquity of this architecture cry out for a different explanation. This wasn't imitation or a trend. It was a legacy. The legacy of a single, global civilization that existed before the catastrophe that buried its cities. A civilization that possessed technologies we are only just beginning to rediscover. They knew how to work with stone in ways we still cannot replicate. They knew the secrets of logistics that allowed them to transport giant granite blocks for thousands of miles. And perhaps they held the ultimate secret: access to an inexhaustible source of energy. Look closer at these buildings. The spires reaching for the sky, the metal domes, the antennas and intricate ornaments on the roofs. What if they aren't just decorations? What if they were elements of a giant energy system, harvesting free energy directly from the atmosphere? That would explain everything. The speed of construction, the ability to light and heat enormous buildings, and the very purpose of such complex and expensive architecture. These buildings weren't just houses. They were machines, nodes in a single planetary network. It then becomes clear that the people of the 19th century, in most cases, didn't build these cities. They found them. They dug them out from under the layer of mud, repaired them, adapted them for their own needs, and then claimed their history as their own, creating the myth of great construction projects and founding fathers. They were inheritors, not creators. We are living in the stage set left behind by a bygone golden age, by a world that was far more whole, advanced, and harmonious. A world without borders, which spoke a single architectural language. But if this civilization was so powerful, if it had wrapped the entire planet in its energy grid, what force could have possibly destroyed it? Local wars or natural disasters could not have erased an entire world culture from the face of the earth. The cause of its demise must have been as grand as the civilization itself. The catastrophe must have been on a truly planetary scale. The force capable of crushing a unified world civilization did not come from man. It came from the cosmos, or from the depths of the planet itself. About 400 to 600 years ago, the first and most devastating strike occurred. This isn't the ancient mythical flood whispered about in legends. This was an event right on the edge of our historical memory, an event that tore the fabric of time and became the starting point for a new, distorted world. We even have evidence of it, but we've been taught to ignore it. When we look at paintings by late Renaissance artists like Piranesi or Hubert Robert, we see majestic ancient ruins with tiny human figures wandering among them. We are told these were romantic fantasies, products of an imagination celebrating a bygone antiquity. But what if they weren't fantasies? What if they were documentary sketches from life? Eyewitness reports that captured the real world as it was after that very catastrophe. A world lying in ruins. This was no mere storm or earthquake. The planet itself seemed to convulse. Early maps that have survived show us a completely different geography, with continents connected where oceans now exist. In that moment, the Earth expanded, tearing apart the land bridges. The continent we know as America was definitively separated from Asia. The engine of the Earth's climate broke down. Thriving lands turned into scorched deserts. This is how the Sahara was born. Other regions, in contrast, were overgrown with impenetrable jungles. The northern hemisphere may have taken the main blow, becoming a crater-scarred wasteland. The great pre-cataclysm civilizations and their last representatives, whom we remember as giants, as well as mythical creatures like unicorns, disappeared forever. The world was thrown back, but not completely destroyed. Knowledge was lost, technologies were forgotten, but the survivors remembered. They remembered the former glory, the Golden Age, and they began to rebuild. What we see today, those cities in a single architectural style all over the planet, is not the legacy of that first pre-Diluvian civilization. It is the result of the titanic efforts of its heirs. They are the fruits of a great worldwide reconstruction that took place roughly between the 1600s and 1800s. The survivors, scattered across the planet, began to rebuild their cities, their energy centers, trying to revive the lost harmony and power. They weren't just building houses, they were erecting a monument to what was lost, and at the same time, a tool for its revival. They were trying to restart the old networks, to recreate the world as it was meant to be. It was a short but brilliant post-cataclysmic renaissance, a flash of the old world's light in the encroaching darkness. However, this heroic revival was doomed. The civilization, weakened by a global cataclysm, was just a shadow of its former self. It was vulnerable, and a new power decided to exploit this vulnerability. A power that did not seek to restore. It sought to conquer, subjugate, and rewrite reality itself. While the survivors looked to the heavens, remembering the stars and free energy, this new power looked to the earth, to resources, and to people as tools. The resurgent world became the arena for a hidden, ruthless war. A war not for territory, but for the very legacy of the old world, for its knowledge, and for its future. This quiet battle determined the entire subsequent history of humanity. The quiet battle for the legacy of the old world escalated into an open conflict that shook the planet in the early 19th century. But in our history books, it's presented not as a single global conflict, but as a series of separate, unrelated events. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the War of 1812 in America, the mysterious Year Without a Summer in 1816 when snow fell across the Northern Hemisphere, the massive New Madrid earthquakes that changed the course of the Mississippi River, and a series of unexplained fires that wiped entire cities from the map, from Moscow to Washington. We are asked to view each of these episodes in a vacuum, as a tragic accident or the result of local political intrigue. But what if these are all links in the same chain? What if these were fronts in a single, total world war? A war that was deliberately erased from history, shattered into pieces to hide its true meaning. The main secret of this war lies in the substitution of the enemy. Historians paint us a picture where Napoleon marches on Moscow and the Americans fight the British. But this is just a smokescreen, a brilliant trick to hide the true participants in the conflict. Imagine that this wasn't a war between these factions, but a war of the united forces of a new world order against the last great bastion of the old free civilization. A civilization known on old maps as Great Tartaria. This was not just a country, but a vast confederation that occupied almost all of Siberia, Central Asia, and possibly even a significant part of North America. It was the last bastion of a world that lived by different laws, without central banks, without a rigid hierarchy of power, and with the preservation of ancient knowledge and likely free energy technologies. It was this civilization that was the true enemy of the burgeoning empires of the West. Napoleon's march on Moscow in 1812 was just one operation in this global war. The real target was not the capital of the Russian Empire, but the destruction of a foothold and allied forces of Tartaria in the West. The mysterious fire of Moscow, blamed on either the Russians or the French, could have been the result of a weapon we can't even conceive of. The same goes for the War of 1812 in America. We are told it was a war for independence against Britain. But what if the true, hidden objective was to destroy the remaining Tartarian influence on the American continent, and to clear the territories of the indigenous population, who were not primitive tribes, but the descendants of that same ancient civilization? The whole story about trading land for alcohol and glass beads is a cynical tale told by the victors to cover up genocide and the destruction of a highly developed culture. The enemy was simply cut out of the equation, and the conflict was rewritten as a family quarrel among Anglo-Saxons. This war was not fought with conventional weapons alone. Climatic weapons that caused the year without a summer and geophysical weapons that triggered earthquakes were all used to break the resistance. And the result of this war was the very same mud flood. The cities weren't just covered in ash from the eruption of Mount Tambora, as the official explanation goes. They were buried as a result of massive bombardments or the use of some kind of energy weapon that literally liquefied the soil, turning it into mud flows that covered entire regions. This was a war of total annihilation, and it ended with the victory of the New World Order. The last bastion of the old world had fallen. But victory wasn't enough. It was necessary to ensure that no memory of the defeated enemy or of the war itself would remain. The victors always write the history. And after the last cannons fell silent, the most ambitious project in human history began. A project to completely falsify the past and create a new, controlled reality. After the last pocket of resistance from the old world was crushed, and its cities were buried under layers of mud, the victors began the most crucial part of their plan: the total reformatting of human consciousness. It was necessary not just to hide the evidence of the war, but to rip out the very memory that another, more advanced civilization could have existed. This colossal operation to create a new reality was waged on all fronts, from rewriting chronicles to controlling the thoughts of every single individual. At the head of this project were powerful structures like the Jesuit order and its associated secret societies, which had been accumulating knowledge and perfecting methods of manipulation for centuries. Their first and primary task was to create a new timeline. History was artificially stretched. An entire fictional millennium was added to the real, relatively short history of mankind, the so-called Dark Ages. This time gap was filled with imaginary events, dynasties, and wars to push the ruins of the real ancient civilization into an unattainably distant past. To solidify the new timeline, a single Gregorian calendar was imposed, and all competing local calendars, which held the memory of true dates, were declared pagan and mercilessly destroyed, along with their myths and their keepers. Ancient texts containing fragments of pre-Diluvian knowledge were collected, edited, and compiled into a single, canonical, and heavily censored book, the Bible, which became the main ideological tool of the new order. Anything that didn't fit the new doctrine was declared heresy and burned. The next step was to explain the material evidence that couldn't be hidden, the magnificent architecture scattered across the globe. Since the new authorities didn't have the technology to replicate it, the myth of neoclassicism was invented. We were told that in the 19th century, architects were suddenly overcome with a love for antiquity and began copying ancient styles everywhere. This absurd thesis allowed them to appropriate the heritage of the previous civilization and declare it their own achievement. To back up this lie, a wave of forgery swept across Europe and America. Dates on the facades of old buildings were massively recarved, usually to point to the 19th century. Sometimes this was done so crudely and hastily that you can still see the old dates underneath. There are buildings with two dates, for example. Funds allocated in 1535, built in 1914. 400 years to build one house is an absurdity that makes sense only if you assume the first date is real and the second is a fake, added after a restoration. But rewriting the past was only half the battle. It was necessary to establish complete control over the present and the future. For this, modern science was created, not as a tool for understanding the world, but as a tool of control. Everything related to spirit, ether, free energy, and non-material phenomena was banished from it. Science became strictly materialistic and nihilistic, its main task being to prove that man is just a random collection of atoms in a cold, soulless universe. Any attempt to return to the spiritual traditions of the past, to the knowledge of harmony between man and the cosmos, was actively suppressed and ridiculed. At the same time, compulsory schooling was introduced. Its goal was not to give children knowledge, but to implant the approved version of history, geography, and the world order into their minds from a very young age. School became a conveyor belt for producing obedient citizens, incapable of critical thinking and certain of the infallibility of the official worldview. But even in this total system of control, one serious problem remained. What about those who remembered the truth? The survivors of the war, their children and grandchildren who did not accept the new order and continued to tell inconvenient stories about the past. For these people, for the keepers of living memory, special, sinister institutions were created. In the carefully constructed world of the new reality, where history was rewritten and science was put in the service of control, there were people who posed a mortal threat to the system. They were not soldiers or revolutionaries, but ordinary witnesses, those who remembered the world before the reset, before the war and the mudflood. Those who had seen the destruction of the old civilization with their own eyes and could not accept the imposed lie. Their memory was a living refutation of the new ideology. And to neutralize this threat, one of the most cynical and cruel instruments of social control was created: the insane asylum. Look at the history of the 19th century. It was precisely in this period, immediately after the global upheavals, that a boom in the construction of asylums began all over the world. And these were not modest hospital wings. They were gigantic, luxurious architectural complexes, looking more like palaces or government residences. Take, for example, the Seacliff Lunatic Asylum in New Zealand. At the time of its construction, it was the largest building in the country, astounding in its scale and extravagant architecture. The official story is that it was needed because of a gold rush that supposedly caused mass insanity. But the population of New Zealand at that time was tiny. Why build such a grand palace for a handful of lunatics on a small, sparsely populated island at the edge of the world? The answer is obvious if you discard the logic we've been fed. These buildings weren't built. They were, like many others, simply occupied. They were pre-existing administrative or healing centers of the old world, which were perfectly suited for a new purpose. Their magnificent and completely inappropriate architecture for a prison is yet another proof of their pre-Diluvian origin. The true purpose of these institutions was sinister. They were not hospitals. They were concentration camps for dissidents. It was here, under the pretext of mental disorder, that everyone who posed a danger to the new regime was brought. Those who openly resisted. Those who told tall tales about flying machines and free energy. Those who simply could not adapt to the new, cruel world and were in a state of deep post-traumatic shock after surviving the catastrophe. These people, who could be called free thinkers or keepers of memory, were deliberately mixed with the truly incapacitated to discredit their words and ideas. Stories about the past, coming from the mouth of a madman, automatically lost all value in the eyes of society. It was a brilliant move. The truth was not forbidden, but simply placed in the context of madness and locked away forever behind the walls of these luxurious prisons. The creation of the asylum network was a direct continuation of the medieval witch hunts. The mechanism remained the same: declare the bearers of inconvenient knowledge and alternative worldviews as abnormal and isolate them from society. The Church, which had honed these methods for centuries, actively participated in the creation of the first asylums, passing on its experience to the new, now secular authorities. The appearance of these institutions right after the mudfloods and wars of the early 19th century was no coincidence. It was the final stage of the cleanup. After the enemies of the New World Order were defeated on the battlefield, the hunt for the surviving witnesses began. At first, they were persecuted openly, but a couple of generations later, when the Cabal's power was firmly established, the repression took on a more formal, medical character. Thus, punitive psychiatry was born, the perfect tool for suppressing any dissent and erasing the last embers of living memory. This system of total control, born in the fire of war and built on a great lie, did not disappear. It merely mutated, took on more subtle forms, and became the invisible foundation of our entire modern society. Its legacy defines our lives today, even if we are completely unaware of it. And so here we are, in the 21st century, heirs to a world born of deception and violence. We live in a reality meticulously constructed by the architects of lies 200 years ago, and we don't even suspect it. The legacy of that great reset permeates every aspect of our existence, like an invisible program that runs our lives. We use fossil fuels, burning up the planet, while the knowledge of free, clean atmospheric energy was stolen from us and declared pseudoscience. Our economies are under the complete control of centralized banking systems, created to manage resources on a global level after the destruction of the old world. We are taught from childhood a materialistic science that denies the very existence of spirit and higher purpose, turning us into obedient consumers in a nihilistic universe. We cram for tests on a fictional timeline in school, full of dark ages and unexplained rises and falls, without noticing the glaring inconsistencies and blank spots. We suffer from a deep, pervasive collective amnesia. We look at majestic cathedrals and palaces and believe that our recent ancestors built them with saws and hammers, because that's what we were told. We walk on streets that hide entire floors of beautiful buildings beneath them, and we don't ask questions. We live in a world deprived of its true history, like orphans who don't know their real parents. But even in this artificial matrix, something inside us resists. On an unconscious level, at the level of genetic memory, we feel that something is wrong. We long for a world we have never seen, but which feels vaguely familiar. This longing manifests in our love for old architecture, in our fascination with fantasy, in an irresistible pull toward spiritual quests, toward something more than just material existence. It is the echo of a lost golden age that still resonates in our souls. We are alienated from our own ancestors, from our true culture. But subconsciously, we remember it and strive for it. Awakening from this centuries-long slumber doesn't require revolutions or barricades. It begins with a simple but most powerful action. With a question. Start questioning everything you've considered to be unshakable truth. The next time you're in the old center of your city, stop and look. Look at the buried windows. Look at the incredible quality of the masonry that modern builders can't replicate. Look at the dates on the facades and consider if they look authentic. Find old photographs of your city from the 19th century. You will see deserted streets, magnificent but empty buildings, and next to them, people in simple clothes with primitive carts. Does this picture match the myth of great construction booms and bustling industrialization? The truth isn't hidden in secret archives under lock and key. It's in plain sight, etched in stone, captured in old daguerreotypes, hidden in the inconsistencies of official textbooks. You only need to dare to see it. Amazingly, despite the scale of the falsification, we are only a few hundred years removed from a completely different culture. Just a few generations separate us from a world where free energy existed, where cities were harmonious and beautiful, and where people may have possessed abilities we now consider supernatural. We are much closer to that world than we think. It is not gone forever. Its legacy is in the stones beneath our feet and in the blood that flows in our veins. Awakening from collective amnesia is not just an intellectual exercise. It is the first and most crucial step toward reclaiming our true heritage. A step toward ceasing to be orphans living in the ruins of another's civilization and becoming masters of our own history and our own future once again.